right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the last of the panels of the Dean's Honor Symposium today. Of course, we do have recognition ceremonies after this that we hope you guys will attend, as well as poster sessions that are happening immediately afterwards. My name is David Baring Porter, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Culture and Media here at Lang. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the panelists here today for what has come together to be, I think, a really interesting panel around the idea of reforming history. It's been my pleasure to work with these four students weekly to kind of craft and bring these into more conversation, but I think that one of the things that I most appreciate about this panel is the way that what seems like very contradictory and even issues that are in tension with one another come to actually contribute together so that the whole is actually more than the sum of its parts. So it's very my pleasure to, again, introduce a panel which we've titled Reforming Histories, Queer Faith, Secular Abolition, Institutional Whiteness, Grounded Identities, and we'll be hearing from our panelists today in the following order. First, we'll be hearing from Lina Landstroem from Sociology, Religious Studies, and Gender Studies. Next, we'll hear from Nikolas Swihart from History. Third, we'll hear from Hunter Stewart, Global Studies. And finally, leading us off will be Grace Song. So let me hand this off to Lina. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
So welcome, everybody. I hope you all got some cookies on your way in. I'm Lina. I'll be talking about queer faith. And you might wonder, why talk about this history? Well, I am a queer Christian myself, and being a queer person of faith isn't always easy. You're sort of stuck in this in-between of a Christian community that is not always welcoming of LGBTQ persons, but also a secular LGBTQ movement who's not always welcoming of people of faith, and especially Christians of faith. And my focus in this work has been in the United States in the mid-20th century forward, and particularly Protestant Christianity. So I hope that with this presentation I can raise some awareness about this important history, and that you might approach this subject a little differently moving forward. So let's start off by just looking briefly at the history that we may or may not know a little bit about. Who in here has heard about the Stonewall riots? A good number of you. So the Stonewall riots took place just a few blocks south from here at the Stonewall Inn. It's what we know as what kicked off the LGBTQ rights movement as it looks today. It happened in 1969 here in New York. We also have the HIV/AIDS crises in the 1980s, 1990s. And then in 2003, it's this Lawrence versus Texas Supreme Court case, very important because that is when homosexuality the sodomy laws disappeared across the nation. This process started in different states already in the 1970s, but it did not end until 2003 in the Supreme Court case. In 2011, we have Obama signing repealing the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing military to serve openly. Now we see a little bit of a pushback on that in terms of transgender rights, but that's another presentation. And then we have the same-sex Supreme Court case in 2015. So bear these sort of milestones in your mind as we move forward. And now, let's move to San Francisco. The Glide Memorial Church. It's a United Methodist Church, still exists, located in the Tenderloin District. And this is important because the Tenderloin District in the mid-1960s, when we are visiting this church today, was a neighborhood known for the LGBTQ community, particularly transgender youth, and a pretty poor community. And in this mid-1960s, a pastor served there called Reverend John Moore. And John Moore is a straight, white, married man with children. And he served this church and held a 3-part sermon series in 1965 in January, where his second sermon was on homosexuality. And in this sermon, he talked very openly about allowing homosexuals into their community, into the church. And this, of course, got huge tension, not only all across the United States, but all across the world. This was radical for its time. In 1965, talking about welcoming homosexuals and LGBTQ people into your community, it was radical. And so radical that he got letters from all over, all the way to Sydney, Australia. You can see part of his sermon on the left and on the right, your left. And on the other picture, you have a letter from Del Martin, who, does anyone recognize the name Del Martin? No, okay, so Del Martin and her partner Phyllis Leone were the most important early lesbian activists who founded the first lesbian organization in the United States, Daughters of Elites, in the 1950s. And Del Martin's partner, Phyllis Leone, worked for the Glyde Memorial Church for some time a little later in the 1960s. I have a lot in my hands. So in 1960s, in Glyde Memorial Church in San Francisco, there was also, it's a huge church, and so another minister serving there was also Reverend Ted McVenna. This was the youth minister at the church, and he was responsible for the outreach program and founded outreach programs for transgender youth serving the community. Among other things, in 1966, Glyde Memorial supported the founding of Vanguard, a very radical organization, particularly for transgender youth of color, in 1966, and they met in Glyde Memorial Church. Ted McVenna is also important in 1964. This is very early. He saw the importance of bridging the gap between homosexuals and the church. So in the summer of 1964, he organized a retreat for a group of ministers and a group of homosexuals, and this is the language they used then, to go on a retreat and meet and have a conversation. And this was so successful that they founded an organization out of this called the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. This was founded in 1964 and lived on for a couple of decades and got chapters across the United States. And as a fundraiser for this organization on New Year's Eve 1964 going into 1965, they organized a New Year's Eve ball for the LGBTQ community. And they remember that homosexuality is illegal. It's illegal to serve homosexuals. My mic is a little funny. You want me, the AV guy is not happy. They organized this New Year's Eve ball as a fundraiser, and it's illegal to serve homosexuals alcohol at this time. But they had talked with the police, and it was fine. The police was going to just let them be to have this New Year's Eve ball. And this happened. The police started harassing them New Year's Eve 1964, and eventually the police forced themselves into the place where this took place in San Francisco and said that there was fire safety issue and started arresting people who were at this ball. On New Year's Day, 1965, January 1st, this was the front page in San Francisco, where ministers were speaking out on behalf of the LGBTQ community, on behalf of the homosexuals. Remember, we're still 4 years away from Stonewall. This is early. And this was news not only in San Francisco, but this was also front page news in places like Chicago. So this got nationwide attention of how the ministers were speaking out on behalf of the homosexuals. In 1968, the Metropolitan Community Church was founded by Troy Perry in Los Angeles, particularly for the LGBTQ community. This is a church that still exists and have some 300 congregations around the world in some 40 countries. They have a chapter here in New York, and this is still a church founded in 1968 serving the LGBTQ community. And there is so much more I wish we would have time to talk about, but we're running out of time. I do want to point out that the Christian right that we see today, the homophobic Christian right as we see it, is actually a backlash social movement that started in the 1970s after all of this took place. I wish I could speak on the rest, but if we have some time during the Q&A later, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. But finally, I just want to mention that thanks to gracious funding from the organizers, from my church, Church of the Village, who's located a few blocks away, and from Lang Civic Engagement and Social Justice, I was able to attend this conference, this one-time conference, Rolling the Stone Away, in St. Louis last fall, where the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies in San Francisco, or in Berkeley, outside of San Francisco, California, organized and got a bunch of these activists and heroes on this subject together to speak on this topic for 3 days. And I got to hear Chuck Lewis talk about how he was involved in the founding of the Council of the Religion and the Homosexual, and was at that New Year's Eve ball and was arrested. And I got to hear all of those stories firsthand, which I'm very grateful for, and I'm happy to speak more about it later if we so have time. Thank you. And I hand it over to Nikolas.
Hello, my name is Nikolas Swihart. I'm a fourth-year history major, and I'll be presenting today on secular abolition, focusing on the abolitionist Eliezer Wright. Wrong button. Now, what is a secular abolitionist? An abolitionist are those that demand an end to an institution, and they're particularly associated with ending the institution of slavery. Now, I'm focusing on the secular abolitionists because they don't believe that religion was necessary in order to persuade potential allies. Now, the historian of abolition, James Stewart, describes the abolitionists who fall out from the church over the issue of slavery. He says here that they move towards a diffuse, disorganized religion of humanity, hoping, as one explained, to be less orthodox but more Christian by scraping formal theology for a pure humanitarian creed. I believe Eliezer Wright was one of these individuals who scraped formal theology for a pure humanitarian creed, leading him to a secular approach to abolition. Now, why secular? Because the title of the book that I just quoted from is Holy Warriors, conjuring images of John Brown-like abolitionists using their religious fanaticism in order to justify their position in opposition to slavery. I don't think that connotation is necessary, and I think Eliezer's Wright career proves this. I won't have time to elaborate on every disagreement Eliezer had with his contemporaries, and instead this presentation will focus on a few moments in his career that highlight his transformation to a secular abolitionist and what I think the implications of that approach were. Now, Eliezer was born in 1804 in Connecticut. His father was a strict Congregationalist as well as a mathematician and amateur scientist. He moved his family to Ohio's Western Reserve when Eliezer was very young. It's here that Eliezer's father instilled in him a sense of social reform combined with his faith, ideas they took from the Second Great Awakening. This spiritual revival stressed the agency that all people had and their relationship to God and their conscience. And it's this rejuvenated belief that they could, through their actions here on earth, eradicate sin throughout society. It's from this environment that Eliezer would develop his sense of social ethics that so clearly led him down the path of reform. Eliezer would go to Yale, originally seeking to become a priest. It's at this time that he was presented with classrooms that presented with science that he felt he could not reconcile with his faith. Ultimately, this would lead him not to take the step in the direction of becoming a priest, but instead to become a school teacher. Unlike his father, he had to reconcile the sciences he was learning at Yale with the faith that his father had instilled in him. It's in 1829 that Eliezer would take a position at Ohio's Western Reserve College, and with this job would come his first real opportunity to express his abolitionist position. Now, This is where some history and context matters a little bit in the abolitionist movement. It was very common in the early 19th century for abolitionists to take the stance of colonization. What this means is that instead of freeing slaves and giving them rights in the United States, they would fund the repatriation back to Africa. This is actually how the country of Liberia was originally founded. The American Colonization Society, the largest of such of these organizations, was the one who started this. Originally, Eliezer was persuaded by this, but he became convinced by another important abolitionist at the time, William Lloyd Garrison, that this was nothing but a defense of a white supremacist society. And it was because of this criticism that Eliezer also became convinced that immediate abolition or immediate emancipation was the only moral position Christians like himself could take. He began to publish in the local newspapers in Ohio, advocating for the position of immediate abolition and immediate emancipation. Originally, they were willing to let him publish whatever he wanted until he began to become critical of his contemporary Christians. Because he himself was a Christian and saw that the immediatism was the only position that his conscience could lead him to, he decided that other Christians had to take this belief also, otherwise they were contradicting themselves. When he began to make these criticisms, the newspapers became worried, as well as his peers at the college, as well as the president. The president asked him to tone his rhetoric down for fear that the college would get a radical reputation, and it would actually influence the way financial donors would view the institution. Instead of toning down his rhetoric, Eliezer was invited east to New York City to help found the first national abolitionist society in the United States, and he moved there in 1833. Now, he would serve as secretary of this organization for 6 years. This is important because while most states already had an abolitionist society, this was the first one on a scale of this size. And as secretary, he was essential to coordinating this movement across the entire United States, from postal campaigns to promoting literature throughout the entire country. This did not mean, though, that he stopped his criticism of Christians he saw were contradicting their own faith. He kept his rhetoric alive, critical of priests in New York City, who with one breath preach from the Bible that it is a mortal sin to steal a pin, and in the next appeal to the same Bible to show that stealing a man or a woman is no sin at all. It's these sort of contradictions to Eliezer that put him on a path towards the secular approach. Obviously, to him, the religious-oriented strategy of the society was failing. They needed another approach, and he decided that political action would be the means to achieve this. Now, the abolitionist here, Theodore Weld, was on the side of religious-oriented abolition, and he viewed Eliezer as becoming too radical, to the point where, once again, just as he was in Ohio, pushed out for his radicalism, Theodore Weld and other Christian abolitionists would push him out as well. Quotes like this proved to them that he wasn't a true Christian in the sense that they thought was necessary in order to be a true abolitionist. This was all right with Eliezer because he decided that another strategy mattered more to him, political action. Now, he left the American Anti-Slavery Society after 6 years to go to Massachusetts to become the editor of the Boston Abolitionist Society's newspaper. It's here that he was able to use his newfound authority to advocate for the first national abolitionist party in the United States, the Liberty Party. This is a party devoted to human rights and ending slavery. It would never achieve any serious national change or national action, but it's important, as all third-party politics are, in that they force the larger political movements to take these parties' planks with their own movements. Eventually, because of the failures of this party, he would end up leaving as the editor of this newspaper to go on to do other things in his career. To go on to do a number of other things in his career. But this wouldn't be the last of his abolitionist It wouldn't be the last of his abolitionist actions in his life. But it's important, and this demonstrates the peak of what a secular approach to abolition for Eliezer looked like. Now, what is the legacy of this approach to abolition? For Eliezer, secular action ultimately revealed itself in political action. This style of abolition, I would say, became essential to ultimately ending slavery. The political agitation that those like William Lloyd Garrison and Theodore Weld had been advocating for was not doing it not doing well enough according to individuals like Eliezer. Now, I think this is important because it shows that he had insight into what ultimately would lead to the end of slavery, political action, and it's important because it took his position, his transformation towards a secular activist to get him to this point. It's also important because that secular action always plays a role in social movements, even in a time we don't typically associate with them, like early United States history. Eliezer proves that we don't have to make this association, and when James Brown titles his book Holy Warriors, it's misleading in that it ultimately misconstrues the place of abolitionists like Eliezer Wright. Now, secular history is American history, and it should always be essential to understanding its past. Now, another larger point here, and I think it's a point that Lina's presentation makes as well, social movements are heterogeneous. They're made up of a lot of people who have a lot of different perspectives. Sometimes these perspectives conflict, but ultimately having as many perspectives as possible is essential to any good social movement. Homogenizing it, whether it be homogenizing it in the sense that all abolitionists are religious, or all Christians are anti-LGBT, is a failure on all our parts to recognize the way that these movements operate. We should never allow ourselves to homogenize them in that sense. And if the new school is as dedicated to social justice as it claims, recognizing that it takes these multiple perspectives is something that should always be essential when advocating for social justice. Thank you.
Hello. It's great to see everyone, see all the people. I'm ready to get into this conversation with you all. So, hi, my name is Hunter, and today we're going to be talking about whiteness. Yes. So I'm about to give you a small snapshot about how and where whiteness creates and shapes space within the university. We will begin to understand whiteness not just as a color, but instead a system that creates space for itself and prevents alternative ways of learning and relation to take form. Critiquing a university that considers itself, and I quote from the website, a preeminent intellectual and creative center, unquote, on the forefront of progressive academia, this presentation will challenge you to see the institution as an agent in a system of whiteness rather than an oasis somehow outside the ills it purports to challenge. My work may make some uncomfortable. I recognize that as I speak, people may have reactions or contentions with my findings and suggestions. I ask that each of you here today reflect not only on the institution and others like it, but yourselves. We all know the transformative power of education. What I'm offering you today is a space to sit with this discomfort and not ask why I'm bringing this up, but instead how to go on and address these issues in your own work and personal lives. What we're doing here today is unveiling, seeing whiteness in a way that it does not want to be seen. I will not give you answers, nor do I aim to. Today, instead, we're working on developing an awareness to not only point out a gap between the school's words and its actions, but also to shed light on the undercurrents that allow for such an issue to occur in the first place. So this is a piece of my thesis work, and really my aim in my thesis was to investigate the ways whiteness creates and shapes liberal arts institutions such as the New School. Here at the New School, we talk about race a lot. According to a report published in March 2015, more than half of Eugene Lang's course offerings touched on racial groups or concepts from 2012 to 2014. In the time since, not much has changed. In a review of the Eugene Lang course catalog from 2015 to 2018, presently, 52 classes have been offered that include specifically race in the title, and many more have gone on to cover it throughout their courses. But what I've noticed as a Black student is that while race is a common topic here, it is most often discussed through a particular lens, leaving unchallenged the source from which racial oppression largely originates. Almost always missing from the classes, the events, the discussions, and so on, is a discourse that centers any critique of whiteness as a racial category and referent. Most often, instead, whiteness is brought up only as far as in race as white people. Rarely is the conversation broadened and explored in the same ways that Blackness and other racialized experience are brought up here. In the same course catalog search from 2015 to 2018, there was not a single class offered that centrally explored whiteness. Here at the New School, we see white people and what they do, but we do not understand whiteness. That is, the system that marks my body other and some of my peers as neutral. That has yet to receive a class here, at least in institutional memory. We are fully aware of the injury and yet somehow lost as to the perpetrator. There we go. Got it out, thank you. As seen here today, this is not a simple oversight, and it does its own work to solidify whiteness and further subjugate people of color. These next few slides, not gonna lie, they're theoretical and a little bit abstract, but just stick with me so we can get into the examples that I'm gonna give you in a minute. To take up the topic of whiteness, really, we need to understand first how whiteness gains its power. So I'm asking everyone to expand their thinking here from whatever comes to mind when I say white person, and instead understand the socio-political apparatus of whiteness, and by extension, race, that we all exist within. We're all constantly negotiating whiteness and our relationship to it. Illustrated by feminist critical race theorist Sarah Ahmed, whiteness is, as you see on the screen, the unseen or the unmarked, as a non-color, the absent presence or hidden referent against which all the colors are measured as forms of deviance. Pay attention to this definition given by Ahmed. It is in the interest of whiteness to cast the plight of non-white bodies as the near totality of racial discourse. While it may seem good to finally see representation of non-white narratives in the forms of courses that cover race in the USA, blackness outside of the United States, or race in fashion, race in media, the list goes on, we must be critical of the ways in which these narratives are handled and the ways that they're cast. Averting direct focus and critique from white bodies maintains this idea that whiteness is canvas, that white is canvas. In doing so, race becomes situated as an unfortunate truism for people of color. With this understanding, the New School's constant focus on race as a topic just doesn't cut it without dissecting whiteness alongside it. This definition is significant to our conversation today because it allows us to differently understand the New School's proclivity for discourse on racial justice. We can begin to see where and how talking about race, even if in some way it talks about oppression, it can still maintain whiteness as the status quo. So for my thesis, it's still going, but I rely on the pillars given by Diane Kusa in her work, White Institutional Presence. In this, she outlines 4 attributes that make up and define predominantly white spaces, such as the one we're currently in. She notes white ascendancy, white privilege, monoculturalism, and white blindness as common factors in such a space. For the purpose of this talk, though, I'm going to focus on one that I think is essential to understand, but isn't as commonly discussed, that is white blindness. Kusa says that white blindness arises from the failure to recognize white racial identity and ideology. She says that white blindness ignores the fact that white, like black, is also a political social construction category and disregards white responsibilities on a multicultural campus. So who here has heard of color blindness? Like, you get show of hands. Most. I didn't see a non-hand in the air. So yes, we are familiar with this concept. It's the idea that somehow, even though you're seeing someone, you can somehow look past their appearance. You see the authentic person, right, not the color. And we know that absolutely, if you're seeing the person, you're seeing their color. You're going to have that assumption. But this is actually a paradigm flip when we're talking about whiteness. There's a reason it actually can occur to have white blindness. As referring back to what Ahmed says here, by design, the system that maintains whiteness is unseen. That's how it gains power. And this is the issue that the New School as an institution we are effectively seeing. So at this point, you're probably like, what are you talking about? I don't really understand. I don't know what it looks like. So let's get into the New School. All right. So let me get myself here. This concept of white blindness can be most clearly seen in many classes offered at the New School. Take, for example, this course that was offered in the fall of 2017. All that's important to know about this, which is not the professor name or the specific title, is that it was specifically about race and gender. So I'm going to read this description taken straight from the professor's writing. They say, this course explores how race, gender, and other forms of social difference both produce and are produced by global cities. We will examine the race and gender dynamics, and they also later on go, we will also consider how race and gender come together with other categories of difference. Really what's important here is that there's a promise here to discuss race in multiple settings. However, upon looking at the syllabus, we would find that there are 90 of the 39 required readings, only 16 discussed race, and in that, only 2 took up whiteness in any central way. This is an issue as it again casts race as non-white. Many I've spoken with have expressed concern over explicitly focusing on whiteness as a common response is, but by talking about oppression, am I not also talking about whiteness? See, and I disagree with this and instead offer that it will always be easier to trim the stems, but until the roots are gone, the weeds will only ever continue to grow. It isn't enough to spend a semester talking about black and brown death, discrimination, and struggle, which this course largely did. As Kusa says, to acknowledge whiteness is to not perpetuate it, but instead, it's the first step in uprooting it. So I want to really apply this outside of the classroom, because again, it doesn't stop there. So in this February of 2018, students... Yes. I'm on time. What I want to leave you with today is that this course goes on. Today we are talking about institution of higher learning. Of course, that's where we're standing. However, as philosophy professor and critical whiteness theorist George Yancey writes in his book, Look a White, classrooms are microcosms of the larger social order and reflective of powerful problematic racist stereotypes. So I want to bring your attention to a recent campaign led by students of color on this campus. In February 2018, student leaders band together to press the university to account for its complete absence of students of color on campus and raise awareness to the unique tolls and challenges students of color take upon enrolling at this predominantly white institution. So with this, obviously we're doing a lot of posting, trying to spread awareness, and we got some responses. I want to read them with you. Without a critical understanding of whiteness, we see that issues around racial justice and equity are framed as individual complaints rather than struggles against, an overarching system. Lacking discourse around whiteness allows for individual responses you see here. Let's read. First, you could try to stop victimizing yourself, appreciate the opportunity you're given here living in this era, and stop whining, or just keep furthering the racial divide. Another, the make-believe pressure of white supremacy, an NYC at a college, LOL, yikes, you're pathetic and delusional. Another, I think if you're so triggered by white people and that you need an exclusionary segregated space, you need 1, a competent therapist, 2, to drop out and find a different school, and 3, to never be hired or given any opportunity by evil, oppressive whites. I wouldn't hire you. Here, besides being racist, these people are fundamentally misunderstanding or neglecting to operate under the pretense that institutions can and are white spaces that cease to serve and instead actively denigrate students of color. I will not pretend education is the one and only key to eradicating white supremacy, but when we shift our understanding to race to locate whiteness as hegemonic power, we then differently understand real-life situations such as this campaign. Responses like this would become less relevant and blatantly false. So I've given you a lot, and you're probably thinking, okay, what do I do with all this? I don't know, maybe I didn't think about whiteness before. I want you to know that everyone in this room can do something. We can have these conversations, and that's honestly what I've learned through this campaign of how we can start it. 1, discuss whiteness as a system that strategically creates and orients other perceptions and experiences. 2, historicize whiteness in courses. It is beyond the body. 3, hold institutions and the people within them accountable to answer for the ways in which whiteness is enacted. And 4, materially support students, or just people, of color in creating and living by other knowledge bases. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Grace Song, and I will be presenting to you Grounded Identities, a history and context of the Columbus Monument. So during my time here at the New School, I have been studying within the field of history, art history, and politics. And this required me to take a variety of classes between history, art theory, and politics. So politics and history have long been aligned in the discipline of history, but fine art has not. Although there is art history, there is not much of a broader context of the capital letter H history. What I will be sharing with you today is the history of the Columbus Monument, located in Columbus Circle in New York City. So investigating the history of the Columbus Monument allowed me to take all of my lessons with all of the different discipline trainings that I have received and work on a project that incorporates visual objects as historical evidence and a historical event in itself. So you may be wondering about the relevance of this project. Lately, I have been interested in the many articles surrounding the Columbus Monument. The Italian community of New York wants to declare the Columbus Monument a scenic landmark, while others want to remove it due to the violence and genocide and colonization enacted by Christopher Columbus. And so, especially here at the New School, a majority of us do not condone the damages done to the indigenous community, as the US was built on stolen ground. But after looking at all of these articles and debates surrounding the monument, and after looking at the inscription on the Columbus Monument itself, which says, "To Christopher Columbus, the Italian residents in America," I was led to believe that the monument was not just about Christopher Columbus as a figure, but about immigrants and whiteness, as Henry has just defined in the presentation before mine. And so, as a child of 2 immigrant parents, both born and living in America, I became much more invested in this project than I intended to. So I will be investigating a community that claimed an American identity, became assimilated, then also became a part of the complicated racial history of whiteness. So as a history major, I am not interested in giving my political stance for this presentation, but before taking actions as to what to do with this monument, I believe that it is crucial to think about the historical context behind this monument and how it came to have some sort of historical significance. My job is to provide clarity on the controversy, and I hope to bring more information to the table. So the Columbus Monument was first erected by the Italians living in New York on October 12, 1892. The monument was built by Gaetano Russo, as you can see here, in Italy. He was a Sicilian-born artist and was transported by the Italian naval ship, the Lina, in 170 parts. So by claiming Columbus, the community was trying to become a part of America as a nation. Although the Italian community might have been able to put this monument in 1892, the status of Italian immigrants in the US was one of an uneasy state in the 1890s. So in the 1870s, there was a slow and steady immigration, but by 1880s and 1890s, much more were immigrating. Those that were immigrating were mostly from southern Italy. The types of jobs that were held by the southern Italian immigrants were one of hard, physically demanding labor, like working on the city's docks, roads, and rapid transit lines, and building construction sites. So there was a lot of discrimination from the Americans towards the Italian immigrants. So this is a magazine that was, or Harper's Magazine, that was published in 1890, and it says, in the second generation, many Italians easily passed for Americans and preferred to do so, since a most unjust and unwarranted prejudice against Italians exists in many quarters and interferes with their success in trades and callings. So this kind of shows the type of discrimination that existed in the 1890s. So historian of whiteness, Matthew Jacobson, describes a situation where a journalist asked the West Coast construction boss in the 1890s if an Italian is a white man, and so the employer answered, "No, sir, an Italian is a Dago." This was a derogatory term used to describe Italian immigrants in the late 19th century. So it was during those tumultuous times where Carlo Borsotti, as you can see here, created the Il Progresso Italo-Americano newspaper in 1879. This was the leading Italian newspaper circulated in New York City. Borsotti was a big figure in the Italian community of New York and was one that initiated the erection of the Columbus Monument. So he started a subscription on February 10, 1889, and by February 7, 1892, there was a total of $9,115 raised just in subscriptions alone. This allowed the Italian community to feel as if they were contributing to the building of the monument, which then allowed for them to feel excited as the days drew nearer to the days of the celebration and the unveiling that would take place on October 12, 1892. So, in the article from New York Times in 1890, there was a quote from Carlo Borsotti in a newspaper titled "From Italians to America," saying that this monument will be truly a gift to the Italian Americans to America. It is not given by a few men. The biggest subscription has been $200. Subscriptions have come and are coming in from all over the cities in the country. Many of the amounts are ridiculously small, but just as welcome. So this was a public effort of the Italian Americans and was truly their gift to give, as it was not just one entity donating funds to put this project into fruition. The subscription column showed up almost every day in Il Progresso, but the project topic did not only appear on Italian-speaking newspapers. So there were plans for the Columbian Exposition, which was to take place in 1893, and was open towards the public through the Washington Post on May 24, 1889. As seen through the preparation of the World's Fair and the dedication to Columbus, it is clear that including the Italian community in New York, the rest of the Americans also felt that the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering the new land was quite a big deal. The talks at the World's Fair shows that it was the aim of the WASP elites that wanted to show off to the world the dynamism of this country's industry and wealth of its natural resources. Therefore, it's not a big surprise when New York City, as a city, decides to support the Italians and Borsotti in plans for the erection of the Columbus Monument. So in many of these articles from 1890 until the date of the unveiling, there is a ton of acceptance towards the Italian-American community from the general public, at least seen through the newspapers that were being published. The Los Angeles Times article writes of the gift of the monument as to show the gratitude and loyalty of the Italian population here towards the Americans from whom they received hospitality and friendship. By October 3, 1892, an article in the New York Tribune was writing about boarding and lodging accommodations in New York for the celebrations. The article writes that there were 10,000 circulars published for out-of-town visitors and would be distributed by railroads entering the city of New York along the roads of a distance of 1,000 miles from the city. People from all over the nation were taking trips to visit the celebration of Columbus due to the monument being publicized throughout the country in various newspapers, including the one of El Progreso. So on Wednesday, October 12th, which was the great day of the Unveiling, 1892, at 10 a.m. there was to be a military and civic parade. At 4 p.m. there would be the great unveiling of the Columbus Monument on 8th Avenue and 59th Street, as it still remains today. And on 8 p.m. of that day, there was to be a night pageant with floats and illuminations over the route of the military and civic parade that took place that morning at 10 a.m. October 12th was also to be declared a holiday, and all stores in New York, both public and private, were closed for the events of the day. On October 13th, there was to be a banquet at the Lenox Lyceum, but not everyone would be able to go to this event, as it was a dinner to honor the sculptor Gaetano Russo, and one would need an invitation to show up. So, as said by art historian Barbara Grosclose, visual arts were to employ the immediate reciprocity between national identities and national ideologies, while architecture and cultural rituals help generate ideas of community. The Columbus Monument is, in fact, a big part of the Italian American community, but the context of which it was erected should not be forgotten. This project allowed for the Italians to start assimilate into whiteness. The identities grounded for the Italian community was grounded through the Columbus Monument, in which it still remains today. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll come around in a second. I know we have time for some questions, and I think we would love to hear from you. Yeah.
Hi there. So this question's for Hunter Stewart. I just wanted to know, a lot of us know that the new school uses particular imaging or particular branding.
First off, amazing presentation. That was truly informative. So we all know that the new school uses particular images and particular branding in its promotion. And I just want to know what your thought process is, doing this work and what your experience has been, not just engaging, but sustaining the kind of emotional and mental labor that it requires in engaging this and doing this research.
This is okay. Thank you for that question, and it's a great point to make. Not gonna lie, it is hard because again, if we're understanding the institution as a white space, I'm clearly not a white body. I don't fit into it in the same way that others do, and so it has been a lot of work to figure out how to engage in this conversation in a way that's sustainable. Really, what's done that for me is finding those who I can relate with and who understand what I'm going through, and focusing all my energy on loving that community and actively creating. Again, like I said, the fourth point on my last slide, a different knowledge base, a different way of knowing myself and my relation to space. And so that's been the largest thing that's outside of the sort of purview of ones and zeros, this binary way of thinking that the institution, whether or not it thinks it's progressive, would like. So we're doing what we can with what we have. Thank you.
Excellent. Other questions? It'll be easier if we do it.
Okay. I have another question for Hunter. I did love your speech. It was so great. But what is the progress, if there is any at all, on the space for brown or people of color students at the new school?
So thank you for that. I think just out of respect for my colleagues, I'll not go too much into the campaign on that, but I will say that there has been progress and that it's an ongoing conversation again, but almost completely led by queer women of color, pushing the conversation to reflect really what we need on the campus. But I'm happy to discuss that further if anyone's interested after the Q&A. Thank you.
Hey everybody, that was fantastic. I saw the last two presentations, congratulations. I'm an assistant professor here. I teach a course called Black Geographies and another one called Race and Environmental History. And so I want to ask you, I didn't see the abolition talk or the reconciling Christianity and queerness, but I'm fascinated by all the topics, in particular the last two. how would you suggest faculty hold themselves and each other accountable in the context of the presentations that you that you shared with us? I'm faculty. I don't know if there are other faculty in the room, but how do we hold ourselves and each other accountable given what you've shared with us? Thank you.
Hi, so I'm a little biased because I am a history major, but I think it's always really important to look at the historical context of whiteness because whiteness in itself as a socially constructed category has changed very much from, I guess, like the birth of the country to until now. And so I think it's really important to look at how whiteness in itself as a social category has changed and what whiteness entails of as a race too. So I think it's always important to look at the historical context.
Yeah, I'd say in practical terms of what you can do now, and this is something I'm largely learning, just I guess being transparent as a co-leader of the campaign that I mentioned in my presentation, if we're understanding that whiteness operates best when we don't communicate across lines that it makes for us, then anytime we allow these boundaries, so if you want to look at like student to faculty or staff to admin, really any way it goes as a boundary, maintaining those groups is what's hurting us. And so what I found largely in this Claiming Our Space campaign is breaking those down and having crosstalk where we're not necessarily equal, obviously we come from different places, but having this back and forth of, look, as a student, I'm not learning. And that's something I've had to tell professors before. You just need to be comfortable with, as a black student, I'm not getting what these white students are getting out of it. And we need to deal with that. So I think it's being vulnerable, which is then being strong enough to be vulnerable, to have those conversations and to have your people check you on it, both ways.
I think also adding to that is something that Nikolas said in his presentation is the danger of thinking of people as a homogenous group and to not make assumptions of the students you have in your classroom and just always be aware and ask questions and ask about the students' different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think, like what Lina was saying, when we think about the classroom as a setting with students of all different, supposed to be of all different backgrounds, but certainly of all different perspectives, it's important not to homogenize them when dealing with them, and then to recognize that when they discuss something, they're probably discussing it because that's what matters the most to them, and keeping that in mind when it comes to like not homogenizing that space is essential.
I know that you've all worked very hard over several months on your own projects independently, but there's also this really important part of presenting together and being all here together. Can you talk at all about how coming together to put this panel together has sort of shaped the way you've thought about your own individual project? How has this collaborative process worked out for you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. And I think for me personally, it has sort of brought a larger context to my work because especially in you two are a history, even though I'm not a history major, I have my work is in history in this presentation. And when we look at history, it's so easy to see it very linear and very sort of isolated and to just see it in context of the other histories have been very fascinating, and to have this conversation with people who are not at all in your field has really been raising my awareness for my own topic and the context in which I am speaking, but also in the context of my history.
I think Lina's presentation probably spoke the most to me at first, only because it seemed as though it was in such great tension with mine. But working over the course of the semester is what really led me to the last point of my presentation, is that these movements aren't homogenous, and that we should never assume that just because somebody's part of it, that they hold the exact same perspective that you hold to be like the grand narrative of whatever that movement is. And so that's something that's forced me in my work to take seriously, instead of just focusing on the secular side, realizing that it's not just to prioritize that, but that there are a lot of other people that are partaking in that movement also.
So for me, I think my presentation spoke in large with hunters also, and I think when you study history, it's sometimes like hard to look at what's going on currently, and I think it was really interesting to see like how an issue like whiteness, it still exists, and we still have to talk about it. So I think that really their presentation actually allowed me to like see how my, I guess, like how it exists currently still. And yeah.
Yeah, I think I just echo. I mean, you're exposed to people from disciplines that you wouldn't otherwise see, and I think also just seeing different takes. Me and my work, I tend to focus, just like I said, on the community and what my people need, and really what I need from them. So getting out and really hearing different perspectives has helped me inform my work in other places on campus.
Hi, I wanted to direct my question towards Lina. I guess just a little bit of context in how I'm thinking about this. I grew up in a church in San Francisco that I would say was like slightly left of center, was not LGBTQ inclusive until about, let's see, like 4 years ago. And then it became LGBTQ inclusive. And like 2 years after that, I came out as a trans man. And that was certainly something that was influential in my experience. But I am curious in how one might engage history in changing spaces that aren't originally changing particularly religious spaces that aren't originally accepting but may be open to becoming accepting and inclusive.
Yeah, that's a great question because I mean that is where my project is sort of going and where I originated with my project. And I think the main thing, because religious people, and in particular Christians, love to say that, oh, it's tradition, we've always done it this way, it's always been this way, and it's always going to be this way. And so the first sort of step that I want to do with this work is that just to say that no, it hasn't always been this way. And with that awareness, sort of point out that tradition isn't always as we think that it is, and the traditions that we hold so tightly in some communities does not have such a long history as we assume it to have. So I think that is number one, and number two, just seeing all the fantastic and amazing and growing in life, filling and spiritually nurturing things that churches have been doing while including LGBTQ folks historically, and how it is very how you can grow as a church and grow spiritually in a church community while including everybody and while being radically inclusive and radically loving. So I think that is how I, in sort of this first step, see my historical work working in that context.
Any other questions?
I've seen 3 panels today, and I've really been moved by all of them. So I really want to thank you for your work and for threading your thoughts together. One of the panels that was talking about things that were hidden and hiddenness, and it was and how those things come to the fore and if they need to. And your resonating word history here. So I just wanted to one of the hidden histories of Lang College is that Jane Lazar was here, who wrote very importantly 2 texts on whiteness, and was a great colleague of Sekou Sundiata's. There was discussions over 20 years between all kinds of colleagues about this lack of depth and breadth of dialogue, both in curriculum, but also in terms of faculty. And in her, Jane, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. It's really worth reading. But in her frustration after 20 years at Lang, she did retire. But the ongoing need for all of us to be reawakened, to remember history, and to be provoked and to be challenged is I just want to thank you for that.
So I know that some of you, if not all of you, are preparing to graduate this semester. Congratulations. And so I was wondering if your choosing of your topic had anything to do with what's next for you guys, or what did you learn from each other from your own projects and your own research to kind of like take away from your experience at the new school and what you want to leave behind, or maybe come back and try to change?
I can start because that is a great question. Well, I'm heading to divinity school in the fall, and I'm very much planning to continue doing this work while I'm doing a master in theological studies. So, yes, I'm heading to Vanderbilt Divinity School, and that decision was very much influenced by this work that I've been doing in the past year.
I'm actually in the BA MA program, so I'm still going to be here at the new school next year doing history. And also I will probably be carrying on this topic into my master's thesis. But I think what Hunter was pointing out with the white blindness is definitely the thing that I'm most going to take away of the 3 in remembering, like, this is something you should be constantly made aware of, otherwise it just falls on deaf ears, and you forget that this is something you should take seriously. And so that's one important, to end my bachelor's year, being reminded of that, I think, is really nice.
So I came to, whiteness wasn't my first idea for a thesis topic. Actually, I was thinking all of like this laundry list of things around blackness and race to do. And then one night I was really thinking of, why am I motivated to do this work? I've written this essay every class for the last 3 years, about why Black people are legitimate. And it's because I've almost always been that 1 to 2 to 3 Black students in the class, and I feel like I have to not validate for myself, but I refuse to let others invalidate us. And so I was thinking about my thesis, and I was like, you know what, my last going out, I'm flipping the script. We're turning it around, and we're looking at those who don't get so scrutinized. And really, that shifted me so deeply to where I can now live life, and this goes on to where I'm going after university, in understanding that I can just love my people, many of them here today, so I just want to say thank you for that. And I don't need to explain that anywhere else, and instead, I just need everyone else to be doing their work because I'm doing mine. And so that's really where this thesis is coming from. And so really just focusing on how can I aid in community building outside of university and take the work that I've done through this thesis, but also through my capacity as a co-founder and leader of Students of Color Weekly, and then co-leader of this Claiming Our Space campaign. And then I think also just in terms of learning from each other, it's really the takes. And each of us in our presentations are dealing with whiteness in a different way. And so it's very informative, again, to me to hear different audiences negotiate these issues in different contexts.
I'm also in the BA MA program, so I will be spending another year here, but I am planning on applying for a PhD history program, so if anyone knows any connections. But my project also did not start out as looking into the Columbus Monument. It was, in fact, I was going to look into art collections in different universities, so I've been grappling a lot with how to tie fine arts with history. And that's something that I've just always been interested in. And I guess this project was sort of a a testing grounds for me. So I will be continuing on studying memorabilia and Americana and whiteness, which is all very interesting for me, and I love studying that. So yeah. And as for like what I got out of this panel was really like understanding that history is complex, that there is no just one narrative, and you have to consider all of these complexities in order to be better informed and to live out in a civil society.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for your questions. Join me in thanking the panelists.